What do you do when you wake up from surgery and learn your wife spent the night at her ex's place, then tells everyone you are overreacting? How do you stay calm when her friends laugh at you, her family blames you, and she keeps saying it was just a couch? This is how I stopped arguing, stayed lawful, and quietly made sure I would never lie in that hospital bed as her husband again. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible stories. My name is Calder Vyne, and when I woke up after surgery, the first thing I saw was the ceiling light humming above my bed instead of my wife's face. The room felt cold and gray, the monitor beside me blinked softly, and there was that strange, bitter taste of anesthesia in my throat that made my own body feel far away. I turned my head toward the visitor's chair, expecting to see Liora half asleep with a blanket over her shoulders, the way she always said she would be if anything serious ever happened to me. The chair was empty. The blanket was folded neatly over the armrest, like someone had taken the time to leave everything tidy and then walk out without looking back. I checked the clock above the door and saw that visiting hours were close to ending, which meant that if she had been there, she had already been gone a long time. For a moment, I told myself she had just stepped out for coffee, because that story was easier to live with than the idea that I had woken up alone. A nurse came in with a tablet in her hands and asked how I was feeling, and I said I was a bit dizzy, but mostly okay. She smiled and said that my wife had managed everything so well on her own, that she had been here earlier and had done great, and that I was lucky to have someone like her. I nodded because it was easier to accept the compliment than to ask why I did not remember any of it, or how long earlier actually meant. While she adjusted my IV, the nurse mentioned that Liora had warned them I could be emotional after anesthesia, so they should not worry if I said strange things or got dramatic. The word dramatic sat in my chest like a weight, because I had not said anything yet, but my reaction was already prepared and handed out like a script. When the nurse left, the room slipped back into a soft quiet, broken only by the beeping of machines and the wheels of carts rolling past my door. A few minutes later, the door opened again, and Liora came in with a cardboard coffee cup in her hand and a fresh-looking bun in her hair that did not match the idea of a long, sleepless night in a hospital chair. She leaned over, kissed my forehead, and asked how I felt. But there was a slight tension in her shoulders, like she was checking my mood more than my health. I asked her if she had gone home at all, because I could not tell if these were the same clothes as yesterday or not. She told me that she had stayed close by, that it had been impossible to drive back and forth while she was so tired, and that it would have been dangerous for her and pointless for me. Then she added that Damon lived near the hospital, that he had offered his couch, and that she had taken it so she could rest and be strong for me. She said it in a calm, practical tone, as if she were talking about parking or traffic, not about spending the night in her ex's apartment while her husband was under anesthesia. The medication made my thoughts move a little slower, but not slow enough to soften her words. I asked her what time she had gone there and what time she had come back to the hospital, because those details suddenly mattered more than the color of the walls or the number of stitches in my side. She waved her free hand and said that I was missing the point, that she had been there when it counted, and that only an insecure man would be upset about a couch. Her voice rose a little when she said that word, as if she wanted anyone walking by to hear that this was about my insecurity, not her choice. For a moment, I stared at the coffee cup in her hand and wondered if I was supposed to thank her for this version of support. The nurse returned to check the monitor, and Leora's tone shifted instantly. She told the nurse that I was feeling sensitive, that the medication sometimes made me think too much, and that I should not be taken too seriously if I sounded upset. I watched the nurse's face move from neutral concern to a polite, understanding smile, like she had heard this kind of explanation many times. The nurse told me that recovery was not the time for jealousy, that I should rest and let my wife take care of things, and that I was lucky she had handled so much alone. I felt something sharp rise in my throat, but I swallowed it, because arguing in that moment would only prove the story Liora had just handed them. When they walked out into the hallway together, talking about discharge dates, I stared at the curtain near the window and listened to their voices shrink into faint echoes. Later, when the room was quiet again, I reached for my phone on the bedside table and unlocked it with clumsy fingers. There was a message thread from the night before, the one my foggy memory was trying to piece together. I scrolled back and found it. My question asking if she was close, and her reply saying she was at Damon's place because she was too tired to drive home after leaving the hospital and that she would come back in the morning. The words were clear and simple on the screen. I took a screenshot without thinking, then another, as if I were afraid the text might suddenly change or vanish. I did not know what I would do with those images, only that they felt like something solid in a day where every story around me was already being bent. A nurse later took me for a slow walk down the corridor, pushing my IV stand beside me. As we passed the nurse's station, I caught a piece of a conversation between two orderlies. One of them mentioned my bed number and said I was the guy whose wife still crashed with her ex and cried about it later. The other laughed softly and said he had heard that story too. I kept my eyes on the scuffed floor tiles and pretended I had not heard them, counting each step until we reached the window at the end of the hall and turned back. In that moment, I understood that the version of events leaving this building did not start with my surgery. It started with a joke about an overreacting husband and a very considerate wife. Back in my room, lying under the thin blanket, I opened the calendar app on my phone almost without thinking. A reminder popped up from an earlier week, something I had set when life still felt simple. Library 4 p.m. It was useless now, but I tapped it, changed the title to a single quiet word only I would understand, and moved it to a different day. It felt strange, using a calendar like a private notebook instead of a schedule, but it also felt like a small, silent act of control. I set the phone back down on the table and closed my eyes. The room was half dark when my phone vibrated again. I opened my eyes and saw the screen light up with a muted call from a contact labeled only as private. The name told me nothing, but the timing said enough. Before I could reach for the phone, footsteps sounded in the hallway, and the door latch clicked as the nurse pushed it open. The bright corridor light spilled across the floor, and in the same second, the call disappeared from the screen. I lay still, listening to the nurse ask if I needed anything, and wondered who needed to speak to my wife without a name, and why that conversation always seemed to end the moment someone else walked into the room. The week I came home, the apartment felt smaller, as if the walls had leaned in while I was away. Every step I took reminded me of the stitches in my side, and every corner of the place carried some small sign that life had gone on without me. In the kitchen, 2 mugs waited on opposite counters instead of side by side on the rack, like they had been put down by people who did not want to stand too close. Liora stood at the sink with her phone in one hand, scrolling with quick, practiced movements. She told me I could sit, and she would make tea, and her voice carried the flat tone of someone reading a script, not offering comfort. I sat at the table and told her I wanted to talk calmly about the night she spent at Damon's, about the choice she had made and what it meant for us. She sighed loudly and said she had already explained everything, that she had been tired, that Damon's place was close, and that I was starting this again because I liked drama. I reminded her that I had woken up alone, that even the nurse had already been told I was emotional before I had opened my mouth, and that now the story in the hospital painted me as a jealous husband who could not accept help. She said she had only warned them about my sensitivity because she knew how I could be, and that if they saw me that way, it was not her fault. When I asked again for simple times, when she left the hospital, when she arrived at Damon's, when she came back, she refused to answer and called it an interrogation. She said that only a controlling man demanded a schedule from his wife. I looked at the clock on the microwave, listened to the kettle heating on the stove, and kept my voice level. I told her I did not want to control her, that I wanted to feel like my wife chose me when I was at my weakest, not her ex. She rolled her eyes and said that if I trusted her, this would not be a problem, and that any reasonable man would be thankful she had someone near the hospital when he could not take care of himself. Then she added that Damon had done more for her that night than I had, because I had been asleep and useless. The words were simple, but they cut like something sharper than any surgical tool. It was not only that she had gone there, it was that she felt comfortable weighing us against each other in front of me. When I returned to work a few days later, I hoped the story would at least stay inside our home and the hospital, but the Open Plan IT office showed me how far it had already traveled. I sat down at my desk, logged into my computer, and saw one of my coworkers grinning at me from across the cluster. He held up his phone and showed me a post from Liora's account. In the photo, she stood at a small gathering with a drink in her hand, smiling wide. The caption said that she had crashed on her ex's couch while her poor husband panicked, followed by a row of laughing emojis. The comments were full of people joking about jealous men and modern love. My coworker said my wife had a great sense of humor and asked if I was really okay with it. I told him it had been a long week and turned back to my monitor before my face could betray the answer. Jonas, who usually stayed quiet and focused on his own tasks, came over a little later under the excuse of checking a ticket on my machine. He reached past me and closed the browser tab with the post, then asked in a low voice if things at home were stable. I said the surgery had gone fine and recovery was slow, and left the rest in the air between us. He nodded and said that once something reached the internet, it rarely disappeared completely, even if people deleted it. He added that if I ever needed to understand how backups and screenshots worked beyond the basic training, he could walk me through it. I told him I already knew enough, and in a way, I did. The screenshots from the hospital night were still on my phone, quiet and patient. Later that day, on my way home, I stopped at the supermarket to buy bread and a few small things. In the checkout line, a neighbor from our building stepped in behind me with a basket and greeted me with a warm smile. She said she had seen Liora's post and joked that my wife must be a saint to handle my jealousy, and that she hoped I had apologized by now. I felt the heat rise in my face and ears, but I answered that things online did not always show the full story. She laughed and said that sometimes women just needed friends their husbands did not understand. Standing there between rows of candy and magazines, I understood that the story had moved beyond our walls and our workplace into the mouths of people who barely knew us. That night, my eyes landed on a thin binder labeled Household on the shelf in the living room. For the first time, I pulled it down myself instead of letting it gather dust. Inside were bills, insurance notices, and random letters. I sat at the small desk in the corner and arranged them by date, adding a few of my own pay stubs and copies of Milo's school papers. On my laptop, I created a simple spreadsheet with initials and dates, noting the surgery, the night at Damon's, the post, the supermarket conversation. Nothing dramatic, nothing anyone else would notice if they glanced at the screen. It was just a quiet list of events that had actually happened. On my phone, I opened my calendar again and created an event titled Meeting Personal Dockside 9:30 a.m., then moved it to the following week and turned off the sound. When I walked into the kitchen for a glass of water later, I saw Liora leaning against the counter with her phone in her hand, typing fast. For a second, before she noticed me, I caught a glimpse of a message preview that included my name and the word overreacting. As soon as she saw me, she flicked the message away, locked the screen, and gave me a bright, thin smile. She asked if I was still keeping track of everything she did, like some kind of walking security camera. I told her I was just thirsty and reached for a glass, trying to keep my voice calm. On the table behind me, my own phone buzzed softly with a small calendar notification about the meeting personal. I had not told anyone about. Liora's eyes moved from my face to the screen and back again. For a long moment, her deleted message and my hidden reminder floated between us in the silence, two secrets facing each other in the middle of our kitchen, both waiting for the day they would stop being private. The first time I saw Liora with Damon in public after the surgery was at a rooftop bar that one of her friends had chosen to cheer everyone up. She told me it would be good for us, that people thought I was sulking, and that showing my face would prove I trusted her. I told myself I was going to observe, not argue. When we stepped out of the elevator and into the soft glow of string lights and music, I watched her move ahead of me toward a group near the railing. Damon was already there, leaning back with his arm on the edge, laughing at something Tasha had just said. Liora slipped into their circle like water, her hand landing on his shoulder for balance as she adjusted her heel, and for a few seconds she did not even look back to see where I was. I joined them with a small nod, but in that moment it was clear who belonged at the center of that little world and who was just visiting. People greeted me with a mix of politeness and curiosity, like they were glad I had shown up, but also waiting to see if I would fit the version of me they had heard about. Someone asked how I was recovering, and I said the surgery went well and I was taking it day by day. Before I could add anything else, Liora laughed and told them I had been so nervous that I had tried to ban her from seeing anyone while I was in the hospital, including Damon. She said it as a joke, but the word ban landed heavily and stayed there. Damon raised his hands like he was surrendering and joked that he was just a piece of furniture with a spare couch. A few people laughed and looked at me, checking my reaction, and I felt myself becoming a character in a story I had not agreed to tell. At one point, someone asked Damon if he had fun playing nurse, while my wife ran around between the hospital and his apartment. Liora leaned into his side, her head close to his shoulder, and said that some exes knew how to show up when it mattered, unlike some husbands who preferred to sleep through the drama. She said it lightly, but I saw the way phones shifted in hands, how people's eyes flicked down to screens as if they were ready to capture the moment. I could have reminded her that I had been under anesthesia, that my sleep had not been a choice, but I knew saying that out loud would only feed the script she had written. So I took a sip of my drink, kept my voice quiet, and answered questions about my recovery instead. Near the bar, I spotted Jonas, who had been dragged there by a mutual friend from the hospital. He gave me a small nod from across the room, the kind men give each other when they do not want to make a scene, but also do not want to pretend nothing is wrong. When he walked over, he did not mention the surgery or Liora's posts. He simply asked how the new backup system at work was running and whether I had tried automatic uploads for personal files too. I understood what he was actually saying and answered that I had started using cloud backups weeks ago. As we talked, my phone vibrated in my pocket, and when I checked it a moment later under the cover of the bar ledge, a small notification slid across the top of the screen. File uploaded successfully. Whatever pictures or screenshots I had taken recently were now not only in my pocket, but also somewhere safe above our heads. Later in the evening, one of Leora's friends shouted for everyone to gather for a toast. People shuffled into a loose circle near the edge of the rooftop, the city lights spreading out below like another crowd listening in. Tasha lifted her phone, already recording, and dragged Liora and Damon closer together for the perfect shot. Liora raised her glass and said that life was short, that you never knew when someone you loved would end up in a hospital bed, and that you had to surround yourself with people who really cared. She turned her head toward Damon as she said it, then glanced at me with a smile that was more like a challenge than affection. A few people whistled. One shouted that I should chill and be happy he had taken care of her. I felt the warmth of embarrassment climb my neck, but I did not move, did not shout, did not grab anyone's phone. When the toast ended, a chant started for "story, story," and someone called out for Liora to tell the full thing again for the camera. She laughed and said she would, but that everyone had to promise not to tag me if I looked too serious. The group crowded closer, phones lifted, lenses pointed like small bright eyes. As I stepped back toward the railing, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a group chat notification with a new video thumbnail already labeled with my wife's name and Damon's. I watched the tiny image of them on my screen, their faces close, her laughing at my supposed jealousy, before I locked the phone and slid it back into my pocket. Around me, camera flashes lit up the night, and Tasha's voice rang out, telling everyone to smile. In that moment, I understood that I was no longer just a husband. I was a quiet extra in a story being recorded, edited, and shared without my consent, while the rooftop became a story other people replayed on their screens. But the next scene I remember most clearly was not the bar or the laughing faces. It was the playground down the street a few days later, where the noise was softer, but the questions were sharper. Milo wanted to go on the swings after school, and I took him because the weather was clear and he had spent the whole morning asking if things were normal again. We walked past the low fence, and he ran toward the slide while I sat on a bench nearby. 2 other parents stood a few steps away, talking quietly. They glanced at me, then at each other, and I heard my name mixed with the word jealous, and Leora's name mixed with poor thing, and stuck with him. I focused on Milo climbing the ladder, but their words did not disappear just because I refused to look at them. When Milo reached the top of the slide, he sat down and looked at me instead of pushing off. His small legs swung back and forth as he asked in a clear, careful voice whether it was true that his mother had stayed with Damon instead of with me at the hospital. The slide seemed higher suddenly, and the air around us felt thinner. I walked closer and told him that sometimes adults made choices that hurt other people, even when they told themselves they had good reasons. I added that his mother and I were still talking, and that none of this was his fault. He thought for a moment, then asked if I had been scared when I woke up alone. I told him the truth. Yes, I had been. Then I helped him slide down, and he ran off to the swings, leaving the question hovering in the space between that platform and the bench, unanswered in a way that mattered. That evening, we met both sides of the family at a long table in a family restaurant, the kind with bright lights, laminated menus, and too many conversations happening at once. The gathering had been Denise's idea. She said we needed a civilized talk to clear the air and that no one wanted drama. When we arrived, she was already seated near the center, her phone on the table beside her water glass. Liora sat on her right, Tasha on her left. My parents were pushed a little further down, nearer the end with Milo. Leonard sat beside Denise, staring at the menu like the numbers there might solve something for him. Plates and cutlery clinked, chairs scraped, and yet everything felt strangely staged, like a family photo where everyone was told to hold a smile until it hurt. Once drinks arrived, Denise tapped her glass lightly and said she wanted to speak first. She said she was grateful her son-in-law had survived surgery and that they were all relieved, but that she was worried about the way I had treated her daughter since then. She described my questions about the night with Damon as constant accusations, my hesitation at the rooftop as sulking, and my move to the guest room as emotional punishment. Liora kept her eyes on her plate, letting her mother speak for her, which she had always been good at. When Denise finished, she looked at me and said that marriage was about trust, and that a man who loved his wife did not interrogate her like a criminal for accepting help from an old friend. I took a breath and kept my voice level. I said that I had been under anesthesia while my wife slept in her ex's apartment, that I had woken up alone in a hospital bed, and that I had learned where she spent the night not from her first words to me, but from the way she later framed it as my insecurity. I said I did not yell, did not throw anything, did not forbid her from having friends, but that I had asked for basic respect and clear answers, and that I had not received either. The table went quiet for a moment. Then Liora finally spoke, saying I was making everything sound much darker than it was, that I was leaving out all the ways she had been there for me, and that I loved playing the victim so people would feel sorry for me. A few relatives nodded, more out of habit than conviction. Greta, who had been silent until then, set down her fork and asked Liora one simple question. She asked whether, if their positions were reversed and Liora had been in a hospital bed after surgery, she would have been comfortable with me sleeping at an ex-girlfriend's apartment instead of with her. The question hung over the table like a low cloud. Liora laughed, but it did not sound happy. She said it was different, that she would not be as dramatic, and that this comparison was unfair. Denise quickly stepped in, saying times had changed, that people could be friends with exes, and that only insecure spouses saw danger in every couch. Leonard tried to play peacemaker. He said we both had made mistakes, that stress and fear could make people act strangely, and that maybe we should all agree to stop bringing it up and move on. His eyes, however, flicked toward Liora more than toward me. Tasha, who had been quiet and glued to her phone, briefly lifted it and pointed it toward the table as if to record, then seemed to think better of it and lowered it again. Still, I saw the reflection of our tense faces on her screen, the echo of the rooftop bar in this supposedly safe family space. The plates arrived and people pretended to focus on their food, but the taste was thin and distant. After dinner, when we finally escaped the noise and stepped back into the quiet of our apartment, I walked over to the wall planner in the kitchen. The squares of the month stared back at me, empty except for a few notes about work shifts and school events. I picked up a red pen from the counter and slowly circled the date of that dinner, pushing the ink harder than I needed to. Milo wandered into the kitchen and watched me draw the circle. He asked why I was marking that day, and I told him I wanted to remember when everything became clear. He frowned and asked if us being a family was still clear too. The question dug deeper than any of the grown-up speeches from the restaurant. I put the pen down and crouched to his level, telling him that I would always be his father, that this part would never change, no matter what happened between his mother and me. He studied my face like he was trying to see if the words matched my eyes. From the hallway, I could hear Liora on the phone, her voice low but sharp, saying something about me embarrassing her in front of everyone. The wall planner with its red circle stood behind me, a small, silent witness. Outside, the evening light dimmed, and the apartment felt like a stage after the curtain had fallen, with everyone still in costume and no one sure where to go. In that dim kitchen, with Milo's questions still hanging in the air and Leora's muffled complaints drifting from the other room, that took the shape of my son quietly asking if we were still a family, his small voice cutting through the last of my doubts about staying the way things were. I moved into the guest room on a Tuesday night, carrying my pillow and a folded blanket past Liora while she sat on the couch with her laptop open. The television flickered in front of her, but she was not really watching it. Her attention belonged to the bright screen in her lap. When she saw me walk by with my things, she asked if this was supposed to make her feel guilty, if I wanted her to beg. I told her I wanted sleep without arguments, that we were not getting anywhere, and that some space might help us both think. She said that separate rooms were for couples on the edge of divorce, and that if I did not put the pillow back in our bed, I was admitting I wanted out. I did not answer. I just walked down the hallway and placed my things on the guest bed, the one we usually kept ready for relatives. For the first time, it was ready for me instead. Lying in that smaller room, I could hear the faint sound of her TV show through the wall and the occasional buzz of her phone. Sometimes there was a long silence, and then sudden laughter, not the kind she had with me when we were still close, but a sharp, high laugh that sounded like part of a performance. I stared at the ceiling and thought about the circle on the wall planner, about the rooftop bar, about the photo captions, and about Milo asking if we were still a family. The guest room felt like a waiting room for a decision that had not been filed yet. I promised myself that if I moved again, it would not be because she pushed me with insults or tears, but because I had chosen a path I could live with when I looked in the mirror. A few nights later, I came home late from a shift at the hospital and found the stairwell unusually quiet. As I climbed the last set of stairs, I heard Leora's voice echoing softly from the landing above. She was leaning against the wall near our door, speaking into her phone in a low tone, saying she could not talk freely while I was there, that she needed people who understood her, that I was obsessed with the past. I could not hear the other person, but the pauses in her words told me they were important to her. When she saw me turn the corner, she straightened and quickly ended the call, saying to the phone that she would text later and then putting it away as if it burned. She told me it had been a client about a campaign and that I should not look at her like she was doing something wrong. I said nothing and unlocked the door. She walked in ahead of me, leaving a small cloud of perfume and questions behind. In the living room, the household binder sat on the coffee table, still slightly open from when I had last gone through it. I picked it up and carried it to the home office corner. Over the next few days, I added more papers to it. I separated everything into 3 larger binders labeled Home, Bank, and Utilities. I placed Milo's school reports into a separate folder with his name on it. I scanned copies of our lease, pay stubs, emails from school, and anything else that might matter if our conversations ever left this apartment and entered rooms where strangers made decisions. On my computer, I saved the scans into a clean structure labeled Archive A and Archive B with dates and brief descriptions. A single USB stick with the current date written on it in black marker went into a small dish under the Taxes folder on the shelf. None of it made noise. None of it broke anything. The only sound in that corner of the room was the soft whir of the scanner and the click of the mouse. One evening, I told Liora I would be out for a couple of hours after dinner. She asked where I was going and if I had suddenly become social again. I said I had a meeting at the community center just to talk about parenting and schedules, nothing dramatic. She scoffed and said that if I wanted advice, I should ask her mother, who had raised 2 daughters without walking out of the bedroom. I did not argue. I just put on my coat and left. The community center classroom was filled with a few parents sitting on hard plastic chairs. The woman leading the session spoke about co-parenting, about how children needed predictable routines, about how conflict between adults should not spill over them. She never mentioned courts or lawyers, but I listened carefully when she explained how written schedules and clear responsibilities often helped more than vague promises. I took notes in a small notebook, writing down ideas about pickup times, holiday splits, and communication rules. No one there knew what was happening in my home, and I did not offer to explain. It was enough to sit in a room where structure was not treated as an attack. When I returned later that night, the apartment lights were dim. Liora was curled up on the couch with her phone, scrolling through something that made her smile faintly. She asked if I had enjoyed my sad little class and why I suddenly cared so much about rules. I said that when people did not respect unspoken lines, sometimes the lines had to be written down instead. She rolled her eyes and said that if I wanted to make a list of her crimes, I should at least be honest and admit I was looking for a way to punish her. I replied that I was not looking for punishment. I was looking for a way to protect myself and our son if things kept going the way they had. She frowned and asked if I was threatening her. I told her no, I was simply preparing to handle things properly. That word seemed to bother her more than any raised voice would have. Later, in the guest room, I sat on the edge of the bed and opened my phone. I set a new alarm, not for work, not for medicine, but for something else. I titled it Paper Drop, Downtown 10:30 a.m., set it for the following week, and turned off the sound so it would only vibrate. The date matched one of the red marks on my mental calendar, even if it never appeared on the wall planner. When I finished, I placed the phone on the small bedside table and stared at the ceiling for a long time. On the other side of the wall, I could hear the muffled rhythm of Liora's voice as she spoke to someone again, followed by laughter and a door closing. I did not get up. I did not press my ear to the wall. I had heard enough. The next morning, over breakfast, she told me that if I wanted to leave, I should just say so, that she was tired of my quiet judgment and my separate room. She said she would be fine, that people supported her, that she had a life outside of this apartment. I looked at her and answered that if she truly believed that, then she should not be surprised when I acted accordingly. I added that I would not shout and I would not sabotage her. I would simply do what needed to be done in the correct way. Those words made her pause, as if she had expected anger, not calm. She asked what that meant. I told her that soon enough she would see what properly meant. Then I finished my coffee, washed my cup, and went to get Milo ready for school, leaving her alone in the kitchen with her thoughts. In my pocket, the phone with the silent alarm rested against my palm, its future vibration already decided. The for that night was that quiet alarm label glowing back at me. Paper drop, downtown 10:30 a.m. A calm signal that the talking stage was over. The hospital smelled the same as it had on the day of my surgery, a mix of antiseptic, coffee, and something tired that clung to the walls. I had a follow-up appointment scheduled, a simple check to make sure the stitches were healing and the internal work was holding. The date of that appointment matched the one entered next to paper drop on my phone. I arrived early, went through the routine with the doctor, answered questions about pain and movement, and received a brief nod of approval. Afterward, instead of going straight home, I walked down to the cafeteria on the ground floor and chose a table near the center, where people came and went constantly. My hands rested on the table, folded, while my phone and notebook lay side by side in front of me. I had asked Liora to meet me there, telling her we needed to talk in a neutral place. She agreed, after some complaining, saying that if I was going to continue acting like a stranger, we might as well meet in public like one. She arrived 10 minutes late, dressed carefully, with her hair and makeup done as if for another rooftop event. She greeted me with a small, tight smile and sat down across from me. She started talking before I could. She said she had been thinking and that maybe we could try a break without lawyers and without drama. She suggested that I move out for a while, or she move in with her parents, and that we could see how things felt in a few months. She spoke about space and healing, but never mentioned the night at Damon's, never mentioned the rooftop jokes, never mentioned Milo's questions. I listened without interrupting, watching her hands move as she spoke. When she finished, she asked if I could at least agree that dragging strangers into this would make everything worse, especially for our son. I took a breath and told her that strangers were already involved, that she had brought them in with photos, captions, and stories. I said our son had heard more from whispering adults than from his own parents. I added that what I was about to do was not about revenge, but about clarity. Her expression shifted slightly, a small line appearing between her brows. At that moment, a man in a plain jacket approached our table. He carried a clipboard that I recognized only by its simplicity, not by any official seal. He asked for Liora by her full name. She blinked and nodded. He placed a neat stack of papers on the table in front of her and announced that she had been served, then briefly stated that the documents related to a petition and temporary orders regarding property and parenting time. His voice was calm and even, practiced without cruelty. Around us, the clink of dishes and buzz of quiet conversations barely changed, but I felt the air at our table grow heavier. Liora stared at the papers, her fingers hovering above them as if they might burn. She flipped through the first page, her eyes moving quickly across lines of text that summarized our last months in dry, simple language. It said that during my surgery and recovery, she had chosen to spend the night at her ex-partner's residence instead of at home or at the hospital. It mentioned repeated contact with that ex, public statements and posts that cast me as unstable, and ongoing disregard for my reasonable concerns. It listed that there was one child, Milo, and that temporary arrangements were proposed to keep his routine steady while we separated. The petition did not insult her. It did not shout. It simply laid out what had happened and what needed to change. She looked up at me, eyes wide and angry, and asked how I could do this to her in the place where she had supported me. I answered that this was exactly the place where I had woken up alone, the place where she had told everyone I was dramatic before I had spoken, and that it felt appropriate to let the truth sit here too. I said I would follow the temporary schedule in the documents, that I would pay what needed to be paid, and that I would cooperate fully with anything required by the process. I told her I would not fight with her in front of our son, and I would not argue with her on social media. These papers were not the beginning of a performance. They were the end of one. As we spoke, a familiar voice called Liora's name from behind. Denise hurried into the cafeteria, her eyes moving quickly until they landed on our table. She had likely come as soon as Liora messaged her, expecting another private scene she could control. Instead, she saw her daughter sitting in front of a stack of official-looking pages, her face pale, while I sat still and calm on the other side. Denise demanded to know what I had done. I answered that I had only put our situation into that stack in a structured way and asked for guidance from people who handled such matters every day. I said that I was done being the villain in informal stories and preferred to be a clear name in a formal process. A nurse who had once told me I was lucky to have such a devoted wife passed nearby with a tray. Our eyes met briefly. She looked away quickly, but not before I saw the flash of recognition and discomfort in her expression. Jonas, sitting alone at a table near the window with his lunch, lifted his gaze from his phone. He took in the scene with one steady look, then returned his attention to his meal, respectful enough not to stare, aware enough to understand. Liora clutched the papers and said I was destroying our family. I replied that the destruction had started somewhere between her ex's couch and the rooftop bar, and that what lay on the table was not destruction, but structure. I stood up, picked up my notebook and phone, and told her that the schedule written there would give Milo stability, even if it broke other illusions. I said that if she wanted to contest anything, she had every right to do so within the same system I had entered. There was no insult in my tone, only finality. Denise began to talk about betrayal and appearance, about how people would judge her daughter, but her words slid off me like water off glass. For the first time in months, I did not feel the need to defend myself with explanations or shout above a crowd. The papers did not care who told the best story at dinner. They only cared about dates, actions, and signatures. I turned toward the exit, my step slow but steady. Behind me, chairs scraped as people shifted, torn between pretending nothing was happening and watching something they only understood in pieces. As I reached the doorway, the elevator at the end of the corridor chimed, its bell ringing out clearly over the low cafeteria noise. The doors slid open, and a small group of staff stepped out, pausing as they caught sight of the tense scene at the center table. I stepped into the waiting elevator without looking back. The doors closed between me and the cafeteria, between me and the sight of Liora clutching those papers. The last sound I heard before the doors met was the rustle of pages and the faint hush that falls when a story people thought they knew changes shape in front of them. The "in that moment" was the elevator bell and the soft slide of the doors as they shut, sealing the scene on one side and carrying me upward on the other with no applause and no epilogue.